So I would like to move on to the panel for the time. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce two other participants, Greg Richardson and Professor Asaf Zivi. Both of them deserve very special introduction. I'm afraid that without Greg, the event in 2019 and the current one simply wouldn't be shaped the way it was. Greg always offers a lot of creativity, thoughtful ideas. On a practical note, he's responsible for ongoing development on the group enterprise risk management framework at Trust3. Greg is the chief risk officer at Trust3. He also has acquiring responsibilities for connection and relationship with rating agencies. Greg has over 20 plus years experience, including strategic planning. He was a head of property and marine for US reinsurer and chief underwriting officer for one of the reinsurer in Bermuda. And I'm really, really honored to have known him for a good number of years. Asaf was my very good friend. Actually, that dated back at least 15 years ago when we asked Professor Zivi to overview our predictable model. So that was used to call PSG, Economic Scenario Generator. And Asaf played a certain role to review all the parameters and help us with that. Since then, he's pretty much on the panels and where I was moderating all our events, he was part of it. So Asaf is a professor and holder of Kravis Chair at Graduate School, Columbia University. His research and teachings interest mostly lies in the intersection of operations research, statistics, machine learning. In particular, he has been developing theory and algorithms for reinforcement learning, bandit problems, stochastic optimization. I'm just basically reading a few, but he's also very, very helpful in a new type of relationship to developing with machine learning communities. And he's also holds a number of scientific advisory boards for start companies in high-tech sector and many, many awards that I'm going to spend time on mention. So welcome everyone. Hi Greg. Hi Asaf. And hi Karen. Well, I would like to just mention one more person who hopefully will join us soon. It's our another speaker is Dave Snowden. He's a featured guest and featured panelist for this panel. I asked him to observe the panel like from outside point of view of consultant and make a few comments and maybe some suggestions or maybe questions. So Dave, if you're there somewhere, thank you for joining. I will bring you in for the last maybe 15 minutes, if that's okay. Okay, Greg, I think I'm definitely with the breathing out, leave it in your hands. I'm not even going to moderate it. It's all guys yours.
Okay.
Welcome.
So would you like me to start? Anya?
Absolutely. Start and finish and even drive the floor.
Okay. Hit the hook if I go too long. Karen, first of all, thank you so much. I think I may be the unofficial chairman of the Karen Clark fan club. I think I am such an admirer of her work and her journey in the reinsurance space. She epitomizes exactly what I love about the reinsurance industry. It's this elegant, beautiful balance between science and art, or if you will, the theme of our previous conference, order and chaos. So if I say anything that could be construed as critical of Karen, please understand that it's with the utmost respect for her intellect and contributions. So CAT models have been a phenomenally successful transformational technology in insurance and reinsurance over 30 years. They are ubiquitous. They have changed the game completely. So in terms of disrupting technology, it's like a case study that could be studied at the Harvard Business School, I think. And ironically, despite that phenomenal success, they're under intense criticism right now by the practitioners. And it's kind of ironic. Why is it? And I thought maybe it's a bit like marriage, that after as time progresses, you sort of see the flaws in your chosen partner, or in this case, tools, and you forget the reasons that you fell in love with them in the first place. And so, there is a lot of criticism of the models. Some of it is justified. I think some of it's a little bit unfair, probably. But let me enumerate some of the criticisms that are voiced, or at least I've experienced. The first would be chronic underestimation of large events. I think failure to account for or properly disclose limitations, or this goes under Karen's sort of assumptions, bad assumptions category. So, for example, in Katrina, no one really thought about the levee failure, and so when models produced losses, they were the wind only. But then a big chunk of the loss came from levee failure, and in fact, technically not covered losses, but the industry agreed to pay for them. So it's sort of, you can't completely blame the models for that, but it happens, and it happens regularly. Most recently, this year, the power grid failure in Texas, which generated enormous winter storm losses that the insurance industry paid. No one considers that. So is that the fault of the models? Not technically, but it's sort of the fault of the application of the models and the people that use them, that get lulled into thinking, well, they're very accurate. Look at all these decimal points of accuracy, and therefore, we've got it all covered. Well, we really don't have it. And then there's a real long list, but I'll tell you my own personal pet peeve right at the moment. And this is one which could be construed perhaps as a criticism of Karen. So with apologies. So Karen, you used the word return period several times in your talk. And it's a convenient device for thinking about extreme events. But what's hidden in that words is an assumption. And the assumption is that these are Poisson events, and the return period is the Poisson inter-arrival frequency. So you can understand why we use that, because it's convenient. We don't have many data points. In fact, we have to go back to 18 to 11 and sort of manufacture best estimates of a data point to get an idea of what an extreme event might look like for U.S. earthquake. And we ascribe the concept of a return period, and implicitly what leaks into our thinking, into the scientific framework and the very mathematics that underlie these models, is the assumption that events are Poisson. They, in my estimation, not being a scientist, but being a guy that's spent his whole life swimming around in numbers, they aren't even close to being Poisson. So I'll leave it at that, but I'm going to go on. So my point is that all models, all science, I would say, have biases, and those biases are sometimes very surreptitious. They sneak into our thinking. They sneak in the very way we frame a problem, the way we form a hypothesis, and certainly the mathematics that we do. We were going to reach out to a speaker at one point from Germany, Sabine Hofstetter, I think is her name. She's become quite popular lately, and we couldn't get a hold of her. But she pointed out that even the purest of physics and physical sciences and theoretical physics have biases. And the one bias she pointed to was a bias towards simplicity. We all love simple answers. Human mind hates complexity, hates uncertainty. We like simplicity. We want to find the simple theory, the unified field theory. And there's sort of an underlying belief that that's the way God, if there's such a thing, created the universe. And her point is, who said? Why is that? Maybe it's just our anxiety that leads us to it. So my point is, all models, all science have biases. So that's one category of problem with models that I see. Another category I would say is what I might call unintended or unexpected consequences. So, cat modeling has transformed the industry, and it was in itself an amazing disruptive technology. But what it also did was it caused two subsequent disruptive technologies. One is portfolio economic pricing of catastrophe risk, and the second is the introduction of third-party capital into the catastrophic risk-bearing space. So portfolio pricing, third-party capital, or insurance-linked securities, the securitization of catastrophe risk. The first of these lowers the price of diversifying risk. Okay, well, that's kind of good for consumers, not necessarily good for reinsurers, but it says, oh, we don't need to charge for much for this because it doesn't really contribute to our portfolio risk. It has a very powerful effect in doing that. The second innovation, both of these innovations could not have happened with the cat models. So it enabled two additional disrupting technologies. The second one, third-party capital, well, that's interesting because what that does is that lowers the price of systematic risk. So cat models have enabled two new innovations, which are equally powerful and disruptive, which both have the consequence of lowering the price of catastrophe risk. So the net effect has been to dramatically lower the margins that are charged for catastrophe risk. And that in turn has turned the spotlight back on cat models because now they're not, they're, even if they're better now than they've ever been, their errors look bigger because there's no margin to pay for those errors anymore, right? So there's a problem. Now we're going to talk later on today about ESG a little bit. You could say, well, cat models and all this stuff has been good for consumers, and that I think you can make a strong case for it. I think the cost for transferring catastrophe risk is lower now than it was. It offers the hope that maybe places like Haiti, which are woefully underinsured, and we call it the protection gap, California, Australia, other places where there's, or Florida, in fact, where catastrophe risk is underinsured at the extreme levels, it offers the promise for better protection, which is a social good. On the other hand, one could also argue that the proper role of insurance and reinsurance is to put a price, the right price on risk for society, so the society makes good choices and good investments. I think you can make a strong case that we're putting too low of a price on it right now, as evidenced by the fact that we've been, as an industry, been losing money for 5 years in a row. So let me, I'm probably going over, but let me just link this back to the conference we had last year, 2 years ago. We talked about two new modes of scientific thought: complex systems theory and modeling, and machine learning. I really, really believe we are at a juncture in the history of scientific thought. When we were children, at least people my age, we had it drilled into our heads, the scientific method. We formed a hypothesis, we built a model or a theory, we tested rigorously the theory, and only after controlled experiments and all these sorts of things did that theory become true. Now we have two modes of thinking about a much more complex, chaotic world. A world that the reductionist, simple models of the past, the models that put the man on the moon, invented the transistor and all those things, all that science, we now have two new modes. And I believe they are valid modes, but it really puts a tough burden on all of us on this question of what is true versus not true. When can we believe these models? If complex systems, we model elements of very complicated systems, and we model all of their interactions. How can we possibly calibrate or test or validate these models? What are the assumptions when there's enormous complexity built into the models themselves? We couldn't possibly have enough normalized historical data to really test them very well. So a lot of models that we are using, I think climate models fall into this category, suffer from this challenge, I think. Machine learning has a different set of challenges. There's two basic elements that you have to worry about. One is the data you use to train the model with, and the other is the cost function or the objective function that you're putting to that model. What, is the data accurate? Is it good? That's a whole category. But I also think the bigger question there is, what are the assumptions that go into the objective function, the cost function? What are the human values? What's good? What's evil? What's right, what's wrong in those things? Listen to what we're hearing about Facebook right now and the machine learning algorithms that are having such an impact on our life. Who is deciding what is good and what is good and what's bad there? And what are the unintended consequences of those assumptions? And I think models, I'll leave you with one thought. I think with complexity, and this resonates with Karen's comments, sometimes models and the tools we use are so complex that the modelers themselves don't really understand them. They don't understand whether they're right or they're wrong in any objective sense, and they certainly don't understand or comprehend the consequences. So I'll stop there. I know there's a lot of ideas, but I'll stop right there.
Thank you, Greg. Well, I do have a questions for you. So, but I think maybe the best way to do it, maybe we'll pass it to Asaf and Karen, then we'll do another wrap around with questions, okay? Thank you. Asaf, all yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Anya. Again, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks again for thinking of me to be on the panel, and thanks to Karen and Greg for their contributions, obviously. I'll talk a little bit from a maybe slightly different perspective, maybe sort of continuing on the theme that Greg ended with on machine learning and AI algorithms, and what do we have to say there in terms of model specification and misspecification. Let me start off with a sort of broader theme that relates more to the philosophy that Karen mentioned earlier in Box's famous statement about all models being wrong, but some are useful. And that relates to a core premise in optimization. When we come to optimize models or to tease out decisions based on these models, which is the business that most of us are in, there's an important element, of course, of model specification, how correct or incorrect the model is. But there's a very closely related issue in optimization, and one that permeates also most machine learning algorithms, which is sensitivity of the model. So, and this is an interaction between the model and the actual environment. That is, what is the data? What is the environment that's generating the data? So, in particular, think about a situation where, I'll draw from personal experience. I used to be like a hobbyist mountain climber when I was a bit younger and had more cartilage in my knees. And what you see there, like when you do a plan for a summit, it really depends on the altitude that you're in. Like if you're doing planning at around 5,000 meters or 4,000 meters, it's a very different game plan than if you're doing it even at 6,000. And the ideas and the general sort of modeling, if you wish, of the game plan is predicated on similar ideas. The main difference is the sensitivity. The more you rise in altitude, the sensitivity to decision making becomes much more acute. Time spent at certain altitudes could be detrimental in terms of your entire path planning, whereas in lower altitudes, it's a much more forgiving environment. I mean, those of you who dive, you can sort of almost tell the same story about planning dives. So what is that coming from? It's coming from this, again, sensitivity of the objective function. And we see that very, very often. There are many cases we can afford a great degree of model specification error simply because the objective that we're working to try to optimize and the environment that's sort of in charge of that are very forgiving in their nature. And others, it can be very detrimental to make even slight mistakes. So that's an important idea that we all tend to follow when we come to building a model. And this is a big part of what we do as well. We look at the natural phenomena and we build models based on that. And when we build that model, it's really important to know what is that extra degree of freedom that we have. Are we climbing now at very thin air, or are we operating at a level where we can afford to make more mistakes and be a bit more crude in our decision making? To me, that's one of the fundamental premises, and understanding which is very important. Sometimes it's a matter also of a specific element in the model that could basically send us all off the cliff. A good example is in the financial crisis in 2008. One of the major instruments that were underlying the crisis or helped precipitate it were these repackaged mortgages, CMOs, CLOs, CDOs that were traded heavily at that time, and were essentially operating under some assumption about this repackaging. For example, that all these mortgages were roughly equally likely to default, and that default likelihood was very small. And as a consequence, seeing many of these defaults, if these events are independent, would likely leave the CDO intact. What happened in practice is that there was an underlying variable that sort of linked between these underlying names or the mortgages, for that matter, and therefore when one happened, actually many happened. And you can think about it, it's akin to flipping coins. Like the way that the modelers thought about this, these are the modelers who sat at Lehman Brothers and other institutions. They thought about this as having like these 100 mortgages and essentially flipping a coin for each to see whether there's going to be a default. The default probability was reasonably small. And if you flip these 100 coins, what happens? How many of them will actually come up on the bad side? Whereas in practice, what happens is these coins were actually connected with this almost invisible metal rod. And when you flipped, they actually tended to come up on the same side simultaneously more than what you had imagined initially. So that is sort of a key modeling element that was absent in the models that you saw in place that were underlying the pricing and the risk assessment of these instruments, that failed colossally because of that one element that was actually absent. Just adding that one element would have changed the picture quite a bit. For that purpose, to understand that there's this extra modeling element, like correlation among the underlying elements that made up these financial assets, we need a model often that we can understand. That is, we understand that we're flipping 100 coins, and we can model the probability of each coin coming up heads, and we can model this thin invisible rod that connects the coins, how rigid that rod is, how much do they have a tendency to come up on the same side or not. One of the challenges when we go to more advanced machine learning techniques is that we start to lose visibility of what's actually happening in the model. That is, rather than actually building a formative model where you have these 100 coins in my example, you build a black box that sees many such events, data, and reconstruct some way to optimize whatever it is you're trying to optimize. For example, the risk exposure that corresponds to that. But what's happening inside the box is of limited visibility to us. We know how to tune the algorithms to be more efficient, to learn more quickly, to allow certain capabilities in terms of their in-sample and out-of-sample performance, but we don't really understand precisely what's going on inside. This is the current trend in machine learning. The most cutting-edge methods right now that you see implemented in many areas in the technology sector are predicated on this idea of deep learning. These are sort of neural network models inspired by the brain that have many layers, where we really lose track of what's happening. We get really good performance. These models have made huge strides in everything from facial recognition to playing complicated games like Go and chess. But the problem is that we don't really know why they're playing chess so well, or why they recognize this person as a potential suspect and the other person as not a potential suspect. And that really limits our ability to understand that sensitivity that I talked about earlier. Because when we're modeling from the ground up, we have a much better sense of what are the various levers that we're pulling. We have a better model for the environment. In my mountain climbing example, we have various models that tell us how pressure basically changes with altitude, and how oxygen availability changes, and how efficient the body is in processing oxygen given those conditions. But if we just shove the whole thing into a black box and run an algorithm on it, we lose a lot of that visibility. In some cases, we may be able to reconstruct a similar game plan through the algorithm, but we don't really know why Box has sort of provided that type of game plan. And in many areas, this is a very critical issue. If you take, for example, one area where these cutting edge methods are used very heavily, like in autonomous transportation systems, and so driver assist systems as they're currently known, which are moving towards autonomous vehicles. One question for the insurance industry, for example, is attribution of blame if there's an accident. Well, who are you going to blame exactly? Are you going to blame the algorithm? Well, you need to know why the algorithm decided to hit the brakes at a certain point in the intersection as opposed to accelerate. But what actually determined that action? An algorithm that we don't really have much visibility to. We've trained it over many scenarios and found that it works well, but in this case, it didn't. So how do we attribute something to this action? this is going to be a significant obstacle, I think, also from the regulatory standpoint of really confirming that these types of algorithms can be deployed in these situations. And again, I think from the standpoint of insurance, there is a major question of attribution. A similar phenomena happens in an area that I work in as well, which is in healthcare. There's a move to bring more and more sophisticated machine learning tools into healthcare. And as such, there is the same questions that come up there as well. If the algorithms are reasonably opaque, then what happens? How do we provide insights to the physicians in terms of how they actually do perform their duties? In fact, when I presented some of these ideas to acute care staff in hospitals, one of their major concerns was what happens if something goes wrong? I mean, this could be basically open up a lot of liability because these algorithms are running, and if you miss something and you treat differently, the algorithm provides evidence that maybe you screwed up. So there's a reticence to adopt such methods, especially that you don't understand why the algorithm is recommending what they're recommending. So as we sort of attack this broad question of model specification, precision, sensitivity, in a world where we have less and less modeling and more algorithms that are dominating the landscape, I think we're up against challenges that I'm not sure even Box considered at the time when he coined his famous phrase. So that's a challenge for all of us, I would say, as we're moving into that space.
I have a question. Thank you so much. And again, I'll ask one question. We'll pass it to Karen, and then we go around with Dave all together. I just speak to you. So one for Asaf. Can AI serve as a sense-making filter in stochastic models, CAT, ESG, or used to reassemble or bring together the simulated scenarios from CAT and ESGs?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I expect AI tools in that space to be more, initially at least, the adoption will be more as decision support mechanisms, or again, filtering mechanisms, as the question was alluding to. Because again, the complexity of the actual modeling tasks in that space are significant as is. Once you bring in these algorithms, I think there's going to be a lot of questions about, again, attribution of why the algorithm is recommending something versus something else. So I believe, we're going to have a lot more focus on what we call interpretable AI. I think Greg was alluding to that a little bit in the fairness considerations, et cetera, that he was making. So interpretability, and then also using this initially mostly as a decision support mechanism, or perhaps like a recommendation system that recommend one approach versus another, as opposed to providing the definitive solution, at least in initial stages.
You know what? Thank you. I think I'm going to ask one more question because it could lead to Karen as well. How suitable is deep learning in dealing with extreme events? There are too few observations to train the model.
Great question. So when they're usually in most machine learning methods, we still operate in a paradigm which is very, very restricted, and it's referred to as supervised learning. That is, these extreme events provide labels for us, right? It's an event that we label clearly and tag it, and the algorithm then learns based on it. And then there are two challenges. One, as was alluded to in the question, there is a scarcity of these events. So we don't have a lot of labels. Same thing happens in the healthcare domain, where we don't have a lot of patients with a certain type of illness or conditions, because we're all so unique. So that's one major challenge for that paradigm. We see a great promise in that space with what's known as unsupervised methods that don't require that labeling, and therefore may be able to address these types of situations where data is naturally very scarce, because they identify important salient characteristics even in regions where we have more data, although we haven't actually told the algorithm which is which. So that is where I think the field is heading a little bit in terms of, again, on the efficient frontier, more use of unsupervised methods as opposed to supervised methods.
Can I interrupt and ask one question? But Asaf, is there any evidence that humans do better than machines when there's poor data? I mean, would you rather have a poorly trained computer, or do you rather have a doctor guessing? I don't mean that but I'm not sure that's a fair standard either, because humans don't have the data either, or the experience.
Yeah, so it's a great
does
point. I think, if you
extrapolation
look if you look at physicians, for example, they've been trained in a very specific way, which is actually very close to a method that we call in machine learning decision trees, or sort of what would be known more collectively as random forest methods. If you think about current methods du jour in machine learning, essentially you run down a tree and ask a bunch of questions. This is a typical diagnostic approach in medicine. Is it A or B? Go to B. If it's B, then is it C or D, and continue going down. It turns out in most of these knowledge trees in diagnostics are very shallow. We can't really go down more than like 2 or 3 levels, and then we get stuck. At that point, what happens is medicine resorts very much to case-based methodology, where you apply heuristics. You've seen something like this in the past, and therefore you draw some inference. It may be, as you're suggesting, extremely poor inference. To get an algorithm to do that, I think, is a little bit more challenging, because, again, the scarcity of examples. If you've seen 2 patients in the past that have these characteristics, it's literally impossible to get an algorithm, certainly a deep learning algorithm, to come up with that heuristic as effectively as a human being can. But that heuristic in itself, even for a human being, may be somewhat questionable, as you're pointing out.
All right, I'm going to trust my doctor's heuristics then.
That's a dangerous path.
Thank you. Look, I still have ambitions to add at the end Dave Snowden to our panel. So, Karen, please, I would like to pass it to you
now. For that same question?
Yes, you could continue, I guess, with the same question, and maybe, as we discussed, you can share a little bit more specifics about what's different from KCC point of view, what you added. But you can carry on.
Sure. Yeah, and here I will. I'll use like Greg as an example here, since he used me. Is that Greg is a perfect example of people who have gotten jaded about the models and know all the problems with the models. And I actually agree with Greg's. But what I would like Greg to do is, open eyes to more possibility of improvement. Because we have to try to improve. So, Greg, I'll use your example. You used the example of the Arctic air outbreak that you said was a model miss for all the models. Well, it wasn't for KCC. We nailed it on the head, and it's already in our EP curve. So what I would like you to do, Greg, is instead is say, hey, how'd you do it? Karen, how'd you do that? What are you doing? Because what we are doing differently is our scientific process. Okay, so our scientists, before they can build a stochastic model, this is different than any other modeling firm, they have to be able to reproduce actual historical events. So I know that at least given an event, the model is accurate. Okay, and then we use more physical modeling approaches. So we use not just extrapolations from historical data, but actual global climate models and weather models for winter storm and severe convective storm, so that our models are much more accurate, because we're taking all the data in the atmosphere today. We're using current climate, we're using current data. We're not extrapolating from 50 or 60 years ago. So, there is a way, that we're obviously, that's my challenge, is to how do we solve the problems, that Greg is pointing out. And so the way we do it with more physical modeling approaches and a focus on the output, the numbers. You can't have a model and say this great science. What I say, what Greg could say, how does great science lead to questionable loss estimates? And that's, in a nutshell, what KCC is solving. You will not get questionable loss estimates, because that's why you have to put the model, Greg, you have to put the model on the line with every event. You should know what all the models say for Ida, for Maria, for Arctic air outbreak, not this, it's going to be between 5 and 50 billion. I mean, I don't need a model for that. So, because if you know what the model says, really for an event, you can start having more confidence in it. And if the model is wrong, we know exactly where to improve it. And I won't kind of elaborate. I'll make one really quick example, which is hail. Okay, we give, again, hail footprints every day. We have clients that have given us tens of billions of dollars of high resolution claims data. We've been able to validate this. We got some feedback that, we think your model is a little high in the Northeast, low in Colorado. We go back to our scientists. What could be causing this? What could be causing this? And they, sure enough, found in the science that one of these models could be a little biased. So the losses inform the assumptions, okay? The losses inform the assumptions versus the losses being a byproduct of the model, which is what they've been, for decades. It's like you do all this cool science, and honestly, if you're honest, the scientists, the seismologists, the meteorologists and stuff, they don't really groove on the output. It's like, oh, that's boring. Those are numbers. No, we want all the modeling. So we've changed that. And our scientists know that their job is to give Greg accurate loss estimates that he's not going to complain about. And he is going to feel confident that he's going to say, I believe this model. That's our objective. Greg, we think of you every day and say, we're going to make Greg believe this model. So it's a different mindset. It's a different approach to what is the point of a model. We have amazing relationships with our clients. They give us so much rich data, and it's proven to work. So Greg, I've got to prove it to you one of these days.
Thank you, Karen. Look, Greg, I would like, so we're all on the same page. I would like to ask this question to Greg, because I have a list of questions right now for all of you, but I still feel like it's important to bring Dave in before. So before we bring in Dave in, which is going to be right now, Greg, question to you, maybe you can start answering. Models can be used both for capital adequacy analysis, but also for pricing. You may have different motivation in parameterizing pricing and capital models. Have you encountered the problems? If so, how would you deal with that? I don't know if that's a clear question.
Yeah, I think it's a fair question. I think there's enough model uncertainty. I'd rather have one set of models for both, and I think that I guess I'll just suffice it. I'd have to give more thought to it, but my gut instinct is it's hard enough to get one set of truth. Let's not have two sets of truth. Let's try to arrive at the truth and use it, and be clear about the assumptions rather than have to explain to management and the board and in your own brain to sort out the different assumptions. I'd like to have, let's get one set of numbers before we try to create two.
Sure, thank you.
I see a very good question I'd like to answer if we have time.
I know, I see a lot of good questions, and I have put bullet points here and there. So there is a very good question.
About what is the difference between a model and a tool?
Yes.
Do we have time for me to take a crack at that, or?
Yes, we will. Let me just bring in Dave for a moment, and we'll go around questions. And I would love you to answer this question. I see the question. Yes, we have a list of questions now. So Dave, welcome. Dave is joining us as a featured guest for the panel. I'm going to do more detailed introduction when you're going to be about to make your speech. But for the moment, I just say that I asked Dave Snowden to join us, observe the panel conversation, and maybe make some comments and share some thoughts from an outside consulting point of view on the subject. And then if you leave us a few more minutes to answer a couple of questions, that would be great, because we definitely address questions to you during your speech. So what do you think? Thank you for joining, and thank you kindly allocated more time to listen to us.
Thanks for that. I mean, I'm going to pick up on some of these themes in the next half hour. And what I want to focus on then is the capacity of an organization to handle uncertainty. Because I think we over-focus on prediction, and we under-focus on the capacity to handle uncertainty. But I'll talk about that in a minute. I just make 2 points. I think one of the mistakes we make when we compare the way AI works with humans, let's take the doctor example from Asif, is doctors may be trained on a sort of tree-type decision process. But then as they gain experience and they work in teams, they start to acquire other decision-making capacity, whereas models maintain within the constraints of their training data sets. And the other key thing I think to bring out here is human beings have evolved to use abstractions to actually handle abductive thinking. I'll develop this in a minute. So the ability to make completely novel connections comes from human use of abstraction, which is very different from the way that machines actually produce exceptions or weak signals, right? So I think we need to make a distinction between human decision-making and machine decision-making. And we need to make a distinction between human capacity to handle uncertainty. And that's one of the ways we mitigate the risk of predictive capacity within models. And we tend to forget about that measurement.
Okay, thank you for that. I think each of you could reply, right, gentlemen and lady? But thanks, Dave. Let me jump to the question from the poll. What is the difference between the model and the tool that Karen pointed to? So, Karen, would you like to?
Yeah, because I have I think my personal perspective on this is that I used to say first of all, when I started KCC, we had no intention of being in the modeling business. And I spent a lot of time saying, the model is just a tool. Why is the industry relying so much on it? A tool implies to me it's one of many. You're going to build a house, you have a saw, you have a hammer, you have all. So a tool is kind of part of a toolkit that when there's a problem, you pick out whatever tool it is and you put them together and you solve the problem. And I spent a lot of time saying the model is just a tool. Well, what I realized and why we got back into modeling is that there are no other tools really that the insurers have. I mean, it turns out that this framework for all its problems is really the best framework that insurers have. So I think a model versus a tool is something that does provide, and I uncertain answers. I mean, to pick up on Dave's, these are not, they're uncertain, but they do give me an answer. So it's like all the tools are in the model, and it provides an answer. So it's interesting because I also said, hey, it's just a tool, but I realize it's much more than a tool, and it can actually provide output, that somebody uses. And that's why, because of all the complaints, as Greg said, we said, well, we have to build a better model that can at least not be perfect, but improve upon all the complaints that the industry has been sharing with me a lot.
Karen, without you letting you go, another one seems important, maybe aligned with what you're saying. Would you say your approach is more about validation and parameterization, or it is a stochastic alternative to AAR and RMS?
Or is it what? What is the second part?
Stochastic alternative to AAR and RMS.
Yeah, no, I don't. I think it's an improvement in how we build the models. And that's a misconception. As I said, some people think we're building different models. They're simple models. And we say that it's better. And no, that's not the case. We do have different. Some of our models are different in terms of SES, the methodology, but basically it's the same structure. And again, it's probably hard to explain. And we have the same parameters. We have to do the same thing with intensities and vulnerability. So we have the same parameters to deal with. We have the same data to deal with. We're all dealing with the same. It's actually the way KCC implements it and the mindset of our model developers. So it's just a different way of parameterizing, using the loss information to help that parameterization. I mean, maybe we're more like machine learning. Maybe KCC is more like machine learning versus the other models. The other models, it's one way. It's, I do my science, I change the assumptions, ensures you get the losses, that stops there. Whereas with KCC, it's a feedback loop. So the losses go right in. So maybe that's an interesting way to think of us, is we're like the machine learning cat modeler, where all the data that we get is like feeding back into our model almost instantaneously.
Thank you. Well, we have only one round for everyone. Asaf, would you like to do some comments, maybe address Dave suggestions or whatever? It is kind of wrapping up round.
Sure. I mean, I just want to say again, like in terms of this, you know, the machine learning bend on things that Karen also addressed in her last question, and was a subject of the recent question that was posed to us. I would say that if you ask most people who work on more on the frontier in the machine learning community, they will say that there are no models. They're just algorithms. They provide algorithms, and given the data, the test is whether the algorithm will perform well or not. In that sense, it also touches upon Dave's comment that the belief is that some of these algorithms are sufficiently complex and rich that they will end up teasing out of the data underlying structure which has not been revealed to them, like what's a good strategy in chess, and perhaps come up with strategies that no chess master has yet even considered in their arsenal. So from their perspective, the models are too limiting. It's limiting the sandbox too much. You don't want that. That's not what I personally believe in, but what I'm trying to sort of echo what the community, I think, at large is considering as to be on the efficient frontier.
Thank you, Asaf. Greg?
Yeah, I'll just quickly comment. I like the question about the difference between a model and a tool. For me, it's a very important distinction, and what it really has to do, in my mind, is the amount of importance or power you give to this tool. A tool implies the human is in control, and it's something that they are using. A model is more dangerous because you're now ascribing a completeness, you're yielding to it. You're ascribing and giving it power that can be dangerous. And when people give that power to others, even a black box or another person, that's dangerous. And so, to me, that's the big difference. And in underwriting, certainly, I always want the human beings in control. I don't want machines or models making the decisions. They should be tools.
Right. Let's hope for that. Look, thank you all so much. I'm going to stay with Dave now. Karen, Asaf, Greg, again, many thanks. And Greg, thank you for pulling all your ideas together again. Really.
My thanks to you. My thanks to you. You've done a great job.
Thank you.